Rachel Reeves has ignited a political inferno that shows no sign of burning out. Her inheritance tax bombshell, dropped in this year's budget, has left retirees, farmers, and lifelong Labour supporters in shock and fury. The scandal began with a heart-wrenching open letter from a 69-year-old retired scientist, a lifelong Labour voter, who accused the Chancellor of stealing their retirement and destroying their family's future. But this isn't just about one pensioner. Across the country, resentment is spreading like wildfire, and with farmers threatening to escalate their protests, Labour finds itself on increasingly shaky ground.
I think it just shows the nature of the industry, because we've got these massive clouds hanging over us. But as you've just said, the atmosphere out there was really one of pleasantness, of niceness, of people enjoying themselves, despite this massive cloud hanging over us. And there's no denying that this is only the start. We are playing nicely at the moment in the playground in those terms, and we will just keep going. But at the moment, we've got Christmas coming up. We've got the public on side massively at the moment. We don't want to disrupt that. But after Christmas, if the government don't listen and start talking to us, then it will be stepped up.
But the government's saying that they're already listening to you. Today, they've made an announcement that they're injecting 343 million quid into the rural economy in the first week of December. More than 31,000 farmers they claim will benefit, and that's a boost of 5 billion quid to the farming budget. What are you moaning about?
It's all very well them saying what they give us. They're not telling us what they're taking away. And next year, they're removing 78% of the D-Link payments that were due to come to us. And that is a huge amount of money that ultimately goes into the countryside, that when you start to look at wildlife, nature and those sorts of things that we have to do and we want to do to protect at the same time as producing food, the first things we start to pull back on are those sort of things rather than growing the crops. And indirectly, they are affecting the countryside and wildlife and its very existence.
At the centre of this firestorm is the scientist's story, a devastating account of personal sacrifice and shattered trust. Born into a working-class family in Leicester, the pensioner's life was shaped by tragedy early on. At just 10 years old, they watched their father, a World War II veteran, lose a painful battle with cancer at only 45. Left widowed and jobless, their mother had no choice but to raise 4 children alone, scraping by with whatever she could manage. It was an experience that marked the pensioner forever. Inspired by their father's dying lessons of hard work, honesty and standing on your own 2 feet, they devoted themselves to study, becoming the first in their family to attend university. They went on to build a long and successful career as a scientist, a job that was demanding, exhausting, but fulfilling. By the time they retired at 60, they felt a sense of pride. They had saved diligently, planned carefully, and achieved a fully self-funded retirement, ensuring that their children would never endure the same hardships they had faced growing up. But Rachel Reeves' budget has turned that legacy into dust. Under her new inheritance tax rules, pension funds passed on after death will now be treated as part of the deceased's estate. Any savings above the £325,000 nil rate threshold will be subject to the 40% inheritance tax, devastating those who hope to pass on their pensions to their families. For one retired scientist, the consequences of Reeves's policy have been nothing short of catastrophic. In an emotional letter to The Telegraph, the 69-year-old recounted a lifetime of sacrifice and diligence. Previously, the pensioner expected to face an inheritance tax bill of £200,000, a burden they accepted as arguably fair. Now, thanks to Reeves's changes, their bill has skyrocketed to £640,000, an astonishing increase of £440,000, and it doesn't stop there. Their children will also face a crippling £360,000 in income tax on the remaining pension balance, bringing the total tax burden to a staggering £1 million. In their letter, the pensioner described this double taxation as gut-wrenchingly unjust and delivered a scathing indictment of Labour's betrayal. The state has already taken its pound of flesh. Labour's budget punishes people for being self-sufficient to the very end. Until this budget, it had all been worthwhile. Now it feels like everything I worked for has been stolen. Perhaps the most chilling revelation was the pensioners' grim arithmetic. If they were to die before April 2027, when Reeves's tax changes come fully into force, their pension would be worth £800,000 more to their children. The letter's sombre conclusion reflected a betrayal that many ordinary savers are beginning to feel, that Labour, the party they trusted for decades, has turned against them. But the fury doesn't stop at retirees. Labour's tax raid has struck at the very heart of rural Britain, where farmers are now warning of catastrophic consequences for their industry and the nation's food supply. Across the countryside, farmers are rising up, accusing Labour of jeopardising their livelihoods through changes to business property relief, BPR, and inheritance tax. For generations, family farms have been passed down, preserving traditions and feeding the nation. But under Labour's reforms, the tax burden on these farms could become so crushing that many families will be forced to sell their land that, in some cases, has been in their families for centuries. Charles Godby, a prominent farmer, pulled no punches when speaking to GB News. He blasted the government as petulant toddlers for refusing to listen to evidence or engage with the facts. According to Godby, the government's figures justifying their tax policies are not just flawed, they're non-existent. After filing a Freedom of Information request, he revealed that the Treasury admitted they had no figures whatsoever to support their claims on business property relief. This isn't just incompetence, Godby fumed, it's reckless. They've based this policy on thin air, and now family farms are going to pay the price. Godby went on to warn of the devastating ripple effects Labour's policies would have. Food security. If family farms are sold off or broken up, Britain's ability to produce its own food will collapse. Farmers predict that imports will rise dramatically, leaving the country vulnerable to soaring prices and supply chain chaos. Food inflation. Higher costs will trickle down to consumers, driving up food prices and squeezing ordinary families who are already struggling with the cost of living. Hundreds of furious farmers are now mobilising for action. Today, they are gathering at the Business Property Relief Summit in London, a high-profile event that organisers say will send a clear message to Labour. Farmers will not stand by while their industry is destroyed. The National Farmers Union, NFU, has also entered the fray, calling on Labour to pause the changes and consult with farming leaders to find a fairer solution. NFU President Tom Bradshaw summed up the growing frustration saying, "We've offered solutions to make this policy less damaging, but the government refuses to listen. Farmers are ready to work with them, but time is running out." Meanwhile, Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves remain defiant. Starmer's spokesman insisted that the changes would only impact a small number of estates, dismissing the anger as overblown. But that claim rings hollow to those directly affected. Retirees who spent decades saving, farmers whose families rely on their land, and lifelong Labour voters now feel abandoned and betrayed. As anger boils over, the political consequences for Labour are becoming impossible to ignore. The retired scientist's letter is not just a personal cry of despair, it's a symbol of a growing revolt among the very people Labour claims to represent. Farmers are mobilising, retirees are furious, and many working families are beginning to ask, who does Labour really stand for? The question for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer is clear. How long can they ignore this growing storm of fury before it turns into a full-scale political disaster? For pensioners, farmers and savers across Britain, the answer cannot come soon enough.